You know, there are moments in life when the past reaches through time and taps you on the shoulder with fingers made of memory and regret. I had such a moment 3 months ago when I found a diary I thought had been lost forever. A small, leather-bound book that held within its yellowed pages the secret of a love that lasted 50 years, though neither of us ever spoke its name aloud. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning. Or perhaps the end. For in stories like this, they're often the same place. My name is William, though those who knew me in my younger days called me Billy. I'm 83 now, and my hands shake when I hold a coffee cup, but they were steady as a surgeon's when I lifted that diary from the bottom of my late wife's cedar chest 3 months ago. Martha had been gone 2 years by then, and I'd been slowly working through her belongings. Not because I needed to, but because touching the things she'd touched made her feel close again, if only for a moment. The chest smelled of lavender and thyme, that particular scent that clings to things long cherished but seldom disturbed. I'd opened it countless times over the decades, usually when Martha was looking for her grandmother's pearl necklace or her mother's lace handkerchiefs. But this time, as I lifted out the winter quilts and the bundle of letters from her sister in Portland, my fingers brushed against something I didn't recognize. A small book wrapped in tissue paper, tucked deep in the corner where the cedar met the brass hinges. The moment I unwrapped it, I knew. Even after all those years, even with my failing eyes, I recognized the burgundy leather cover, the brass clasp that had long since turned green with age. My heart, this old, tired heart, began to race like I was 17 again, standing at Elena Rossetti's front gate with flowers stolen from my mother's garden. You see, that diary didn't belong to Martha at all. It belonged to Elena, and I hadn't seen it since the autumn of 1958, when everything in my world changed forever. Elena Rossetti moved to our small Colorado mining town in the spring of 1957 when I was 16 and thought I knew everything about everything. Her father had come to work in the copper mine, part of a wave of Italian families seeking their fortune in the American West. The Rossettis rented the small house next to Murphy's grocery store with its peeling white paint and the garden that Elena's mother immediately began transforming with vegetables and flowers that reminded her of home. I first saw Elena on a Tuesday morning in May. I was walking to school, taking my usual shortcut through the alley behind Main Street, when I heard someone singing. The voice was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Not the trained perfection of the church choir, but something wild and true, like a bird that had learned human language but kept all the beauty of its original song. She was hanging laundry in the backyard, clothespins in her mouth, her dark hair catching the morning light. When she turned and saw me standing there like a fool, staring through the chain-link fence, she smiled and those clothespins fell to the ground. I scrambled to help her pick them up, and when our hands touched as I passed her the last one, I felt something electric pass between us. Something that made the hair on my arms stand up and my stomach flutter like I'd swallowed butterflies. "You're the boy from next door," she said, and her voice had just the slightest accent, a musical quality that made even ordinary words sound like poetry. "Next door to next door," I corrected, pointing to my family's house 2 lots over. "I'm Billy Morrison. Billy William Morrison, actually, but that's too many names for one person." She laughed. God, how she laughed. And I decided right then and there that making Elena Rossetti laugh would become my life's greatest ambition. That summer passed like a dream. Elena and I became inseparable, though we were careful about it. Her parents were traditional, protective of their only daughter in a way that my easygoing Irish family couldn't quite understand. We met in secret places: the abandoned railroad bridge over Miller's Creek, the clearing in the pine woods behind the school, the bell tower of the old Methodist church that had been empty since the congregation built their new building on the south side of town. Elena kept a diary. a habit she'd brought from Italy, where, she told me, her grandmother had taught her that a woman's thoughts were precious and deserved to be preserved like flowers pressed between pages. She wrote in it every day, sometimes in English, sometimes in Italian, and occasionally, when she was writing about us, in a mixture of both that she called the language of the heart. By October of that year, I was completely, hopelessly in love. Elena and I had carved our initials into the old oak tree by Miller's Creek, had shared our first kiss under the October moon, had made promises that felt as permanent as the mountains surrounding our little town. We talked about everything. About the books she loved and the songs she hummed while doing chores. About my dreams of becoming a teacher. About the world beyond our small valley that seemed both impossibly far away and tantalizingly close. It was Elena who taught me that love wasn't just a feeling, but a language all its own. She would write little notes and hide them in places where only I would find them. Tucked between the pages of my history textbook, slipped into my jacket pocket when I wasn't looking, left under the loose stone by the bridge where we met. And I, who had never been much good with words, found myself writing poetry for the first time in my life. But as autumn deepened into winter, the clouds on our horizon grew darker. Elena's father, Giuseppe, was a proud man who had left everything he'd ever known to build a better life for his family in America. He worked 12-hour shifts in the dangerous depths of the mine, came home each night covered in copper dust and exhaustion, and worried constantly about preserving his daughter's reputation and his family's honor in this new place where the rules weren't always clear. My own father, Patrick Morrison, was the mine foreman, Giuseppe's boss, and while he was a fair man who treated all his workers with respect, there was an unspoken hierarchy in our town that everyone understood. The Irish and the Germans had been there longest, had established themselves in the positions of authority. The Italians were newer, still proving themselves, still fighting for acceptance. When Giuseppe learned about Elena and me, and in a town that small, such secrets never stayed hidden for long, he was furious. Not because he disliked me personally, but because he feared what people would say about his daughter throwing herself at the foreman's son. He forbade Elena from seeing me, posted her older brother Tony as a constant chaperone, and began making inquiries about suitable Italian boys in Denver who might make appropriate husbands for his daughter. It's strange, the things you remember after so many years. I can't recall what I had for breakfast this morning, but I remember perfectly the way Elena looked that November evening when she met me at the bridge for what we both knew would be the last time. Her cheeks were red from the cold, and there were tears frozen on her eyelashes. She pressed her diary into my hands and made me promise to keep it safe until we could be together again. "Write to me," she whispered. "Write to me in the diary like we're having conversations. Write to me so I won't forget the sound of your voice." I promised. God help me, I promised everything. Giuseppe moved his family to Denver that winter, citing better opportunities and the need to be closer to his cousins, who had established a construction business there. But everyone in town knew the real reason, and I felt the weight of their knowing looks and whispered conversations wherever I went. Elena left on a Sunday morning in February, when the snow was falling so hard you couldn't see the mountains that had always defined our world's boundaries. I stood in my bedroom window and watched the truck loaded with their belongings disappear down Main Street, taking with it everything that had given my life meaning. I kept Elena's diary like a sacred object, hidden in the loose floorboard under my bed, where I'd once kept my collection of baseball cards and my secret stash of cigarettes, and I did what she'd asked. I wrote to her in its pages, pouring out my heart in entries that began, "Dear Elena," and ended with promises to find her, to bring her home, to make everything right again. At first, I was confident that this separation was temporary. I was young, you see, and the young believe that love can conquer anything, that determination and pure intention are enough to reshape the world. I planned elaborate schemes to get to Denver, to find Elena, to convince her father that I was worthy of his daughter. I saved every penny I earned from my after-school job at the hardware store, studied maps of Denver until I knew every street by heart, wrote letters that I never sent because I didn't have her address. But as winter melted into spring and spring into summer, reality began to set in. I graduated from high school, started working full-time at the mine alongside my father, watched my classmates scatter to colleges and jobs and lives that seemed to have clear direction while I remained trapped in the amber of my grief. The work in the mine was hard and dangerous, but it suited my mood. Deep underground, in the narrow tunnels where the only light came from our headlamps, and the only sounds were the persistent drip of water and the groan of timber supports, I could lose myself in the rhythm of pick and shovel. My father worried about me. I could see it in the way he watched me when he thought I wasn't looking. But he was wise enough to know that some wounds have to heal from the inside out. I continued writing in Elena's diary throughout that first year, though the entries became less frequent and more melancholy as time passed. I wrote about my work, about the changing seasons, about the slow realization that I might never see her again. I wrote about my dreams, which were filled with her laughter and her dark eyes, and the way she hummed while hanging laundry in her mother's backyard. And then, one day in the autumn of 1958, I stopped writing altogether. It wasn't that I stopped loving Elena. Love like that doesn't simply disappear. It burrows deep and becomes part of who you are, like coal seams running through rock. But I was 21 years old. And life has a way of demanding that you live it, whether you feel ready or not. Martha O'Sullivan came to work at the bank that autumn, a pretty redhead from Chicago whose father had been transferred to manage the new branch. She was smart and funny and kind, with a practical nature that balanced my tendency toward romantic melancholy. When she smiled at me across the church social and asked if I'd like to dance, I felt something stir in my chest that I'd thought was permanently dormant. Martha was nothing like Elena. Where Elena was passionate and dramatic, Martha was steady and thoughtful. Where Elena was dark and mysterious, Martha was fair and open as a book. But Martha was real and present and willing to build a life with a man who carried old wounds, and that meant everything to a 21-year-old who was tired of loving a ghost. We courted for 2 years, married in the spring of 1961, and settled into the small house on Elm Street that would become our home for the next 57 years. Martha never asked about Elena directly. She was too wise and too kind for that. But she knew there had been someone before her, someone who had left marks on my heart that hadn't quite healed over. Our children came in quick succession. Patrick in 1962, Susan in 1964, and little Michael in 1966. Fatherhood transformed me in ways I hadn't expected, giving my life a purpose and direction that had been missing since Elena left. I threw myself into being a husband and father, into building a good life for my family, into becoming the kind of man my children could be proud of. But at night, when Martha was sleeping peacefully beside me and the children were safe in their beds, I sometimes took out Elena's diary and read the entries I'd written during that first terrible year of separation. I never wrote in it again. That felt like a betrayal of the life I was building with Martha. But I couldn't bring myself to destroy it either. It was a connection to a part of myself that I'd had to bury in order to move forward. A reminder of the boy who had believed that love was the most powerful force in the universe. Years passed. I became the mine foreman when my father retired, then eventually the operations manager when the mine changed ownership. The children grew up and moved away. Patrick to San Francisco, where he became a lawyer, Susan to Seattle, where she worked as a nurse, Michael to Colorado Springs, where he taught high school English, carrying on a dream that had once belonged to his father. Martha and I grew old together, slowly and comfortably, the way couples do when they've learned to love each other not just for who they are, but for who they help each other become. We traveled a little, gardened a lot, spoiled our grandchildren, and built a life that was rich in all the ways that matter most. And through it all, Elena's diary remained hidden in my dresser drawer, wrapped in tissue paper like a relic from another lifetime. Now, I need to tell you something that I didn't discover until that day 3 months ago when I found the diary in Martha's cedar chest. You see, when I unwrapped it with shaking hands and opened it for the first time in decades, expecting to find the entries I'd written during that heartbroken year of 1958, I discovered something that stopped my heart. The diary was full of letters, not my old entries. Those pages had been carefully removed, though I could still see the faint impressions they'd left on the pages beneath. Instead, the diary was filled with letters addressed to me, written in Elena's flowing script, dated from 1959 to 2016. 57 years of letters that I'd never received. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the pages, but I forced myself to read, starting with the first entry. My dearest Billy, December 15th, 1959. I don't know if you will ever read this, but I have to write to you anyway. Papa says I must forget about you, that you were just a childhood foolishness, but how can I forget someone who became part of my soul? I think about you every day, wonder what you're doing, whether you still write poems, whether you remember the promises we made under the October moon. She had continued to love me through everything that followed. Her marriage to Anthony Benedetto in 1960, the birth of her 3 children, her husband's long illness and death in 1995, the grandchildren she adored, and the life she built in Denver. She had continued to love me, just as I had continued to love her. But how had Martha gotten the diary? How had these letters found their way into my wife's possession? The answer came in the final entry, dated just 6 months before Martha's death. Billy, March 20th, 2016. Your wife came to see me today. I don't know how she found me after all these years, but Martha Morrison is a remarkable woman, and I understand now why you chose to build your life with her instead of waiting for a love that might never have been possible. She didn't come to cause trouble or to claim any territory. She came because she's dying, and she wanted to return something that belonged to both of us. Martha had known about Elena all along. Not just that there had been someone before her, but everything. Elena's name, what she had meant to me, even where she had gone after leaving our small town. And in 2016, when the doctors told Martha that the cancer had spread too far for treatment, she had used the last of her strength to travel to Denver and find the woman whose ghost had lived quietly in the shadows of our marriage for 57 years. According to Elena's final letters, Martha had appeared at her apartment one afternoon in March, frail but determined, carrying a small suitcase and a story that took Elena's breath away. She told me that she'd found your diary entries from 1958, Elena had written, hidden in your dresser drawer, wrapped in tissue paper. She'd known about them for decades but had never read them until she was diagnosed. She said she needed to understand who you were before you became hers, needed to know the shape of the love you'd carried so she could honor it properly. Martha had spent 3 days in Denver, staying in a hotel but taking all her meals with Elena and her family. They had talked for hours. About me, about the choices they'd both made, about the strange and beautiful ways that love persists even when it can't be lived out in the open. She's not jealous of what we had, Elena wrote. She understands that loving someone doesn't mean you have to own all the rooms in their heart. She said she's had the best rooms, the ones where the daily life happens, where the children are raised and the morning coffee is shared and the bills are paid together. She said she's grateful for those rooms, and she doesn't begrudge us the small corner where we kept our young love alive. Before Martha left Denver, she and Elena had made an arrangement. Elena would continue writing to me in the diary, but instead of keeping it, she would give it to Martha to hold in safekeeping. Martha would make sure that someday, when the time was right, I would find it and understand the full story of what we had all shared. She made me promise, Elena wrote, that these letters would help you understand that love isn't a competition. She said the love she had with you was different from what you and I had, but not lesser. She said love is like light. It doesn't get dimmed by being shared, it just illuminates more corners of the world. Martha died 2 months later, on a Tuesday morning in May, exactly 59 years after I first heard Elena singing in her mother's backyard. I held her hand as she passed, and her last words were, "Check the cedar chest, Billy. Check the chest when you're ready." But I hadn't been ready. It took me 2 years to open that chest, 2 years to discover that my Martha, my practical, sensible Martha, had been the guardian of a love story that spanned decades and bridged the gap between what was and what might have been. Elena's last letter was different from the others. It was shorter, more urgent, written in handwriting that had grown shaky with age. Billy, August 15th, 2018. I'm in the hospital now, and the doctors say I don't have much time. There are things I need you to know. Things I should have told Martha when she visited, but didn't have the courage to say. The truth is, I never stopped loving you, but I also never stopped being grateful that you found happiness with someone else. Watching you from afar, and yes, I did watch, through mutual friends and newspaper clippings and later through the internet, I could see that you became the man I always knew you could be. You became a good father, a faithful husband, a pillar of your community. You became someone your children could be proud of and your wife could depend on. If we had been together, would you have become that man? I don't know. Perhaps we would have burned too bright and consumed ourselves in the fire. Perhaps we were meant to love each other from a distance, to be the dream that made the reality more precious. She had died 3 days after writing that letter, peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. Her daughter Maria had called Martha to let her know, and Martha had added one final entry to the diary in her own careful handwriting. Elena passed away this morning. She was thinking of you at the end. I hope someday you'll understand what a gift it was to love someone who could inspire such devotion, and to be loved by someone who understood the difference between possession and blessing. Love, Martha. That brings us to last month, when I did something I should have done years ago. I drove to Denver to the cemetery where Elena is buried, carrying a bouquet of daisies. Her favorite flower, something I'd remembered from a conversation we'd had by Miller's Creek when we were both 16 and thought we had all the time in the world. Her grave was in a quiet section under a stand of aspen trees, the headstone simple and elegant. Elena Rossetti Benedetto, beloved mother and grandmother. But someone had been there recently. There were fresh flowers in the vase, and a small stone had been placed on top of the headstone, a Jewish custom that Elena's grandson had adopted from his wife's family. I sat by her grave for a long time, reading passages from the diary aloud, telling her about my life, about Martha, about the grandchildren she would have loved to meet. I told her about the day I stopped believing in love at first sight. Not because it isn't real, but because I realized that what we'd had was actually love at first recognition, the soul-deep knowing that this person would matter to you forever, regardless of whether forever meant a lifetime or just a moment. An elderly woman approached while I was sitting there, walking slowly with a cane, her gray hair caught up in a neat bun. She looked at me curiously for a moment before speaking. "Are you Billy?" she asked. And when I nodded, her face broke into a smile that reminded me so much of Elena, it took my breath away. "I'm Maria, Elena's daughter. Mama told us so many stories about you over the years. She said if a man with Irish eyes ever came to visit her grave, I should give him this." She handed me an envelope, yellowed with age, with my name written across the front in Elena's young handwriting. The same handwriting I remembered from the notes she used to hide in my textbooks when we were 17 and believed in happy endings. Inside the envelope was a single photograph and a letter dated October 15th, 1957, just days before her father had discovered our relationship and everything had changed forever. The photograph showed Elena and me sitting by Miller's Creek, her head on my shoulder, both of us laughing at something the photographer, probably her brother Tony, had said. I had no memory of the picture being taken, but there we were, frozen in a moment of pure happiness, young and beautiful, and completely unaware of the heartbreak that lay ahead. The letter was brief. My dearest Billy, I'm writing this on the night before I tell Papa about us. I know he won't approve, but I also know that what we have is too precious to keep hidden any longer. I want the whole world to know that I love you, that you're the best part of my every day, that when I think about my future, your face is the only one I can see. I'm going to give this letter to Tony to keep safe, just in case something happens, and I can't tell you these things in person. But I'm not worried. Love like ours doesn't just disappear. Love like ours finds a way. Forever yours, Elena. Maria sat down beside me on the bench near Elena's grave and told me more of the story. Elena had kept track of me over the years, had known about my marriage to Martha, the birth of my children, even my promotion to mine manager. She had never interfered, never reached out directly, but she had watched from afar with the kind of loving interest that mothers show for children who have moved away to build their own lives. She used to say that she had two great loves in her life, Maria told me. Papa, who was her companion and partner, the father of her children, and the man who built a life with her day by day. And you, who was her dream, her what if, the boy who had shown her what it felt like to have her heart recognize its home. She said both loves were real and both were necessary, and she was grateful for both. When Elena was diagnosed with cancer in 2017, she had made Maria promise to find me if I ever came looking for her. She had wanted me to understand that she didn't consider our love story a tragedy, but a gift. Proof that the human heart is capable of holding more than we think, of loving more deeply and enduring longer than seems possible. She said to tell you, Maria continued, that you gave her the gift of believing in true love, and that gift made every other love in her life more precious. She said to tell you that love isn't something you fall into and climb out of. It's something you carry, like light in your chest, and it illuminates everything else you touch. I drove home from Denver that day with Elena's diary on the seat beside me, feeling lighter than I had in years. Not because I was finally free of loving her. I understood now that I never would be. And that was exactly as it should be. But because I finally understood the true shape of the story we had all been part of. Martha had given me the gift of a life fully lived, a love that grew stronger through daily choosing, partnership that weathered decades of ordinary moments and extraordinary challenges. Elena had given me the gift of wonder, of believing that love could be transcendent, that the heart could recognize its home across any distance. And both women, in their wisdom, had understood what I was only beginning to grasp, that the human heart isn't a house with only one room. It's a cathedral with countless chambers, each capable of holding different kinds of love without diminishing the others. When I got home that evening, I sat in my reading chair, the same chair where Martha used to find me when I was lost in thought, where she would perch on the arm and run her fingers through my hair until I smiled. And I read through the entire diary from beginning to end. All of my entries from 1958, full of young anguish and desperate hope. All of Elena's letters, spanning 57 years of parallel life. Martha's single entry, written with the grace and wisdom of a woman who understood that love is not a competition, but a collaboration. As I read, I began to understand something that had eluded me for 8 decades. The difference between a love story and a life. A love story has a beginning, middle, and end, with conflicts and resolutions and tidy conclusions. A life is messier and more complex, full of overlapping narratives and loves that don't cancel each other out, but exist simultaneously, like harmony in a song. My love for Elena didn't diminish what I had with Martha. My love for Martha didn't betray what I had felt for Elena. Both loves were real. Both were precious, and both had shaped me into the man I became. That night, I called my children, Patrick in San Francisco, Susan in Seattle, Michael in Colorado Springs. I told them about finding the diary, about Elena, about the secret their mother had kept and the love story that had been quietly unfolding parallel to the family story they knew. They were surprised, of course, but not shocked. Children are more perceptive than we give them credit for, and they had all sensed, at various times, that there were depths to their parents' marriage that they didn't fully understand. Patrick said he remembered sometimes catching me staring out the window with a look he couldn't identify. Susan said she remembered her mother being unusually thoughtful sometimes in October, around the anniversary of when Elena had left town. Michael said it made sense of certain poems I used to recite from memory, verses he had always assumed I'd learned in school, but now realized might have come from a more personal source. But what struck them most wasn't the revelation that I had loved someone else before their mother. It was the understanding that their mother had loved me enough to honor that earlier love, to protect it, and preserve it as part of our family's hidden history. "She was extraordinary," Susan said, crying a little over the long-distance line. "To be that secure in your love for her, that generous with your heart. Dad, you were lucky to be loved by two such remarkable women." My grandchildren have been asking me to tell them stories about their grandmother lately. Now that they're old enough to understand that the people we love carry other loves inside them, that every adult has a history that stretches back before the children arrive to give their lives meaning and structure. I tell them about Martha's kindness, her strength, her ability to make a house feel like home just by being in it. I tell them about the way she hummed while making dinner, how she always left little notes in my lunch pail when I was still working in the mine, how she could make anyone feel welcome at her table. But I also tell them about Elena now, carefully and appropriately, because they deserve to know that love comes in many forms and that the heart is capable of holding more than we think. I tell them that sometimes we love people we can't be with, and that's not a failure. It's just another way of being human. My youngest grandson, Tommy, who is 7 and thinks in the concrete terms that children use to make sense of the world, asked me recently if I was sad that I couldn't marry Elena instead. I thought about it for a long moment before answering. "If I had married Elena," I told him, "I wouldn't have met your grandmother and you wouldn't exist. Your mother wouldn't exist. None of the life we've all built together would exist. Sometimes the path we don't take is just as important as the one we do, because it makes us appreciate what we have." He seemed satisfied with that answer, in the way that children are when adults take their questions seriously and don't try to oversimplify the complexities of human experience. I've started writing again, for the first time since those desperate entries in 1958. Not in Elena's diary. That feels complete now. A closed loop of love and longing and understanding. But in a new journal, where I'm trying to capture the lessons of a long life, the wisdom that comes from having loved deeply and lost honestly and found grace in the space between what we want and what we get. One of the things I write about is the myth of the one, this idea that each of us has one perfect person somewhere in the world, and that finding them is the key to happiness. I think that's a beautiful myth, but a dangerous one, because it suggests that all other loves are somehow inferior, temporary, settling for less than we deserve. The truth I've learned is that we are capable of multiple great loves, each unique and irreplaceable. Elena was my first love, the one who taught me that my heart could expand beyond what I thought possible. Martha was my life love, the one who showed me that real partnership means choosing each other every day, in small moments and large ones, through sickness and health and all the ordinary magic in between. Neither love was a consolation prize. Neither love was a betrayal of the other. They were different movements in the same symphony, different rooms in the same house, different seasons in the same long year of the heart. People sometimes ask me what I've learned about love after 8 decades of living, after experiencing it in so many different forms. The passionate, desperate love of youth, the steady, chosen love of marriage, the fierce, protective love of parenthood, the gentle, amazed love of grandparenthood. What I've learned is that love is not a feeling but a practice, not a destination, but a way of traveling. The feeling part, the butterflies and racing hearts and breathless moments, that's just the beginning. Real love is what happens after the feeling settles, when you choose to keep loving someone even when they leave dishes in the sink or snore too loudly or go through periods where they're difficult to live with. Elena and I experienced love as lightning. Sudden, brilliant, transformative, but brief. Martha and I experienced love as a slow-burning fire that warmed us for decades, that we had to tend and feed and protect from the winds that might have extinguished it. Both kinds of love taught me essential truths about being human. Elena's love taught me that the heart recognizes what it recognizes, regardless of logic or convenience or what other people think is appropriate. Martha's love taught me that recognition is just the beginning. That real love requires daily choices, small acts of kindness, the willingness to forgive and be forgiven, the patience to grow alongside another person as you both change and age. I've also learned that love stories rarely end the way they begin. The boy who fell in love with Elena by Miller's Creek thought that love meant never having to choose anything over anyone, that if two people loved each other enough, all obstacles would simply melt away. The man who married Martha learned that love often means choosing someone every single day, through ordinary moments and extraordinary challenges, through periods of passion and periods of simple companionship. But perhaps most importantly, I've learned that the heart is not a finite resource that gets depleted with use. The love I had for Elena didn't take anything away from what I was able to give Martha. The love I had for Martha didn't diminish what Elena had meant to me. Each love was complete in itself while also being part of a larger constellation of care and connection that made my life richer and more meaningful. One of the great mercies of growing old is the way time changes your perspective on everything that came before. What seemed like devastating losses when you're young reveal themselves to be necessary redirections. What felt like endings turn out to be beginnings in disguise. What looked like failure from up close can be seen, from the long view, as exactly what needed to happen. If Elena and I had found a way to be together in 1957, would we have been happy? I'd like to think so, but honestly, I don't know. We were very young, very intense, very sure that love conquered all. We might have burned bright for a few years and then consumed ourselves in the fire. We might have discovered that the reality of daily life together didn't match the poetry of our teenage romance. Or we might have built something beautiful and lasting, might have raised children who spoke both English and Italian, might have grown old together in that small Colorado mining town or in some other place we chose together. We might have been blissfully happy for 50 years, might never have known what we were missing by not experiencing other kinds of love. The unknowable nature of that alternate life used to torment me, especially during those first few years after Elena left. I would lie awake at night constructing elaborate fantasies about how I could win her back, how we could overcome her father's objections, how we could rewrite the story to have the ending we wanted. But time taught me that the unlived life is always perfect because it exists only in the imagination, where there are no dirty dishes or money worries or sick children or any of the thousand small frictions that make actual love more complicated and more precious than the love we dream about. The life I built with Martha was real in ways that my imagined life with Elena could never be. It was full of imperfections and compromises and moments of genuine difficulty, but it was also full of laughter and partnership and the deep satisfaction that comes from building something lasting with another person. At 83, I wake up most mornings with a sense of profound gratitude for the richness of the life I've been given. Not because it was perfect, no life ever is, but because it was full, complex, layered with different kinds of love and meaning and connection. I'm grateful for Elena, for showing me what it felt like to have my heart recognize its home in another person, for teaching me that love could be transcendent and transformative and worth any sacrifice. I'm grateful that we found each other when we were young enough to believe in magic and old enough to understand what we had found. I'm grateful for Martha, for choosing to build a life with a man who came to her with a heart that was already partially occupied, for having the wisdom and generosity to honor the love that had come before her rather than trying to erase it. I'm grateful for the 57 years of partnership we shared, for the family we built together, for the way she taught me that love could be both passionate and practical, both romantic and deeply rooted. I'm grateful for my children and grandchildren, for the ways they've continued the story that Elena and Martha and I began, for the love they've brought into the world and the love they've taught me in return. But mostly, I'm grateful for the understanding that has come with age. The recognition that love is not a zero-sum game where someone has to lose for someone else to win. The heart is not a pie that gets smaller when you cut more slices. It's more like a flame that grows brighter when it's used to light other flames. Elena and Martha understood this in ways that I'm only now beginning to fully appreciate. They understood that love is not about possession, but about blessing. Not about ownership, but about appreciation. Not about controlling another person, but about helping them become more fully themselves. They understood that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone you love is the freedom to love someone else, to build a life that might not include you, but that honors the love you shared by making them happier, kinder, more complete. As I near the end of this story, and perhaps the end of my own story as well, I find myself thinking about legacy, about what we leave behind when we're gone, about how the love we give and receive continues to ripple outward long after we're no longer here to see its effects. Elena died knowing that she had been loved completely, that her teenage romance with a boy by Miller's Creek had grown into something larger and more enduring than either of us could have imagined when we were 17 and carving our initials into an oak tree. She died knowing that her love had made a difference, had helped shape the man I became, had been part of the foundation upon which I built a good life. Martha died knowing that she had been chosen, day after day, year after year, by a man who could have spent his life mourning what he'd lost, but instead chose to celebrate what he'd found. She died knowing that her love had been the primary force in my adult life, the love that had shaped our children and defined our home and given meaning to my days. And I will die someday knowing that I have been extraordinarily lucky in love. Not because I never experienced loss or heartbreak, but because I learned to see love as an abundance rather than a scarcity, as a gift rather than a burden, as something that expands rather than contracts the boundaries of what's possible. The diary sits on my nightstand now, no longer hidden or secret, but part of the visible landscape of my life. Sometimes I read passages from it aloud to my grandchildren, sharing the wisdom that Elena and Martha left for all of us about the different ways that love can manifest, about the grace required to honor what was while embracing what is. 6 weeks after I first found Elena's diary, I received a package in the mail from Maria, Elena's daughter. Inside was a small wooden box, handmade and polished to a warm glow, with a note that read, "Papa made this for Mama on their 10th wedding anniversary. She wanted you to have it, along with what's inside." The box contained a single pressed flower, a daisy, the same kind I had brought to Elena's grave, and a final note in Elena's handwriting, dated just days before she died. "Billy, if you're reading this, it means the story has come full circle, and you finally understand what Martha and I understood all along, that love is not diminished by being shared, but multiplied. Keep this flower as a reminder that some things last beyond death, beyond time, beyond all the circumstances that seem so important when we're in the middle of them. Keep it as a promise that love, once given truly, never really ends. It just changes form, becomes part of the light that illuminates everything else we touch. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for letting me love you. Thank you for showing me that the heart is capable of holding more than we ever imagined possible. Until we meet again in whatever comes next, Elena. And I'm 83 years old, and I've been loved by 2 extraordinary women who taught me that the heart is not a house with only one room, but a cathedral with countless chambers, each capable of holding different kinds of love without diminishing the others. I have learned that love is not a feeling, but a practice, not a destination, but a way of traveling, not a possession, but a gift that keeps giving long after the original giver is gone. Tomorrow I will wake up in the house that Martha and I shared for 57 years, in the bed where she held my hand as she died, surrounded by photographs of our children and grandchildren and the life we built together one ordinary day at a time. I will make coffee in the kitchen where she hummed while making breakfast, will sit in the chair where she used to find me lost in thought and run her fingers through my hair until I smiled. But I will also carry with me the memory of a 17-year-old girl singing while hanging laundry in her mother's backyard, the knowledge that she loved me for 57 years from a distance, the understanding that some loves are too big to be contained by conventional definitions or expectations. And in carrying both loves, Elena's and Martha's, I will be carrying forward the most important lesson of a long life, that the human heart is capable of extraordinary things when we have the courage to let it love fully, freely, without reservation or fear. The story goes on, carried forward by children and grandchildren who understand that love comes in many forms, that the heart can hold multiple truths, that sometimes the greatest gift we can give each other is the freedom to love without limits. Some loves last a lifetime. Some loves last beyond it. And some loves, like the one that connected a boy named Billy and a girl named Elena by a creek in Colorado more than half a century ago, become part of the eternal light that makes all other loves possible. That is enough. That is more than enough. That is everything.